Hello, everybody. Welcome along. My name is Iain MacLeod, Director of IMMagine Australia, New Zealand. For many, many years, we've been doing seminars, both online and also in person, in various countries around the world, designed for those people who seek a permanent or temporary move to New Zealand or Australia. Owing to popular demand, I've decided to make this one recorded and to put up on YouTube so people can watch it. The whole idea of this presentation then is an introduction to IMMagine, me, my company and services, a bit of an overview of the state of play in New Zealand and Australia in early 2025 in terms of the economy, cost of living, education, and so on. And then we're going to dive into a very high-level overview of visa processes and policies of both New Zealand and Australia. It's pretty much focused on skilled migration to New Zealand and Australia, but just so that you are aware, as government licensed advisors operating in Melbourne and Auckland, we are licensed to provide advice on all sorts of immigration policies, as well as temporary and permanent visas. Now, this video is pretty long. It's going to be around about an hour, and I appreciate you may not want to listen to me babble on for the entire time. So we're going to put up on the screen the times where you can fast forward to those parts that particularly interest you. So there's primarily 4 parts. The first will be the introduction, who we are, what we do. The second is going to be the overview of Australia and New Zealand for those of you who haven't spent time or have family in one of these countries and may want to have a bit of a high-level overview of what your life might be like if you end up by living in one of these countries. Then we will cut to the immigration policies and processes, starting with Australia and finishing up with New Zealand. The whole idea now is that you can get a bit of an overview of how things might work. And then if you wish to find out more information, you can book a consultation with one of me or my senior team, and we can work through the options that are available to you. I've been doing this work now for 36 years. It's a very, very long time, and I didn't used to have grey whiskers when I started, but it's what visas and aging does to you. In that time, the team have helped more than 70,000 people to successfully prepare, lodge, and process various visa types, primarily residency, but we also help those people who may wish to come to New Zealand or Australia to study for a short period of work, who perhaps have no intention to stay long term, but the primary focus of this presentation is for those people who are looking to make a more permanent move. So in terms of the work that we do, we really break it into 4 parts. The first is a free preliminary assessment of your eligibility. A really important point that I like to make at this point in discussions with potential clients is you've got your reasons for wanting to leave home, whether it's fleeing Trump's America, whether it's disintegration in South Africa of the economy and infrastructure, whether it's you're frightened that your pension in the UK is about to be taxed to hell. All of those reasons are really valid, but what's critically important to understand is that immigration policy settings all around the world, not just here in New Zealand or Australia, is by its very nature discriminatory. That is to say, governments choose the types of people and the skill sets that they want. So it's great that you're interested in bringing us what you have, but the important thing is to establish, do I have what the Aussie and Kiwi governments want? So without any charge, catches, or obligations, we carry out a free preliminary evaluation. Now, many of you have already done that, and that's the reason you found this video on YouTube. For those of you that have just found us, thanks to the modern miracles of algorithms, once you've watched this, if you're keen, I do encourage you to go onto the website and complete one of these free preliminary assessments. And within 2 working days, we're going to come back to you and explain very clearly what options you've got. Now, that initial assessment will not tell you how to apply for a visa. It's simply designed to identify what options are available for you in Australia and or New Zealand. If you then decide you want to take things further, then you can book a consultation with me or one of the team, and we will spend an hour or two explaining the detailed strategy or strategies that we have identified, how long things might take, what the major milestones are along the way, how employable you might be, which country might better suit you and your skill set, and of course, how much all of this is going to cost. Then, if you decide you wish to proceed, you can retain IMMagine in Australia or New Zealand, and then think of us as being legal and psychological project managers. You might wonder, what's psychology got to do with it? Well, on the one hand, it's a very complex legal process. You put one foot wrong, you get one thing incorrect, you're not going to be given a visa and you'll not be successful. So, of course, a significant part that we play is ensuring that what the Australian or New Zealand governments receive from you for any kind of visa is exactly what they need to say yes. So IMMagine's primary role is to control the flow of information between you when your future is on the line, and for many of you, your children's futures are on the line, and some faceless state functionary who's going to sit in judgment and decide whether or not you're going to end up by living in Australia or New Zealand. So think of us as being legal project managers. We tell you what documents are required, but we are the ones who then go and deal with the governments and the various third parties and ensure you get what you need for your temporary or permanent stay in one of these two countries. So that's half of what we do. The other half is advice, support, and information. Many of you choose New Zealand. Some of you choose Australia. Some of you are open to either country. And my experience, my 3.5+ decades of experience, tells me the key driver that determines which country you actually choose is based on where you've got a support network. Now, there are some exceptions to that. We are being overrun by interest out of the United States. And Americans are not great on emigrating. And many of them, in fact, don't have family or friends sitting in New Zealand or Australia. But what interests me as a Kiwi, and I spend half my life in Australia and the other half in New Zealand, as in 6 months of the year in each country, is that the Americans overwhelmingly seem to be selecting New Zealand. People from other countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, South Africa, the UK, and those are countries which feature very strongly in our client base, are more likely to be open to both countries or select the country where they have some support network. So as well as providing you with that legal advice, that legal expertise to ensure you get the visas, we're also going to be your new best friends for the next 2 or 3 years, which is how long this process is going to take. We're going to be opening bank accounts for you. We're going to be introducing you to local service suppliers, insurance companies, and the like, and explaining to you how things work. So it's a very comprehensive package of service that we offer. And over the past 36 years, hand on heart, our success rate is well in excess of 99%. Now, that does not mean we can get every person the visa that they want. What it does mean is we seem to be pretty good at identifying who is likely to qualify for the visa they are after, and to then make sure that they get it. So that's basically what we do. We have an office in Auckland, we have an office in Melbourne, and at the moment, the staffing contingent is around about 12 of us. There's 2 or 3 support staff. Everybody else is licensed as required to give immigration advice in New Zealand or Australia. I talk about 4 steps to residency for those of you that have that goal. And watching this might be the first step in that journey. So I'm going to be giving you today an overview of process and policy. Then, as I've just indicated, the idea is you book a consultation, spend time with us, draw on our expertise, pick our brains, and we will explain to you how the on-paper strategy is going to translate into a 2 or 3 year execution to ensure you get what it is you're after. For that, you will be paying 250 Australian dollars at the current time, and this is being made in January 2025, but it will be an incredibly comprehensive consultation. You'll have the chance to ask the questions you need so that you can then think about things, make a balanced decision on doing it or not. And if you then decide you wish to retain us, we will enter into a formal agreement with you, prepare detailed written instructions on what information we need for the various steps along the way. And then we are the ones that are going to be dealing with the faceless bureaucrats in the New Zealand or Australian governments. So a few thoughts before I jump into the economic overview. The decision to migrate is enormous. It's not an easy one to make. In fact, I sometimes ponder if modern humans really did evolve in Southern Africa, as the evidence tends to suggest, I don't know what the hell made them leave home. Because my experience with over 70,000 people who have made the decision to leave home is it is extremely stressful. Most people aren't really certain when they make the decision to migrate that it's actually what they want. So I acknowledge and I accept it's an incredibly emotional process to decide, to execute, and then to settle in a new country. It's logistically complicated. You're thinking about packing up, resigning jobs, leaving friends and family, leaving networks, and starting life anew in a country that many of you may never even have visited. And it probably goes without saying, it is legally complex. Really important point number 2, no government will ever give you 98% of a visa, be that tourist, student, worker, or permanent resident. So you either get this process 100% right, or you will not be leaving home, or you may end up by spending a few years in New Zealand or Australia and then heading home. Only this week, I've had an inquiry from a South African guy living in New Zealand with his family. He's on a work visa, and he's just completed one of our preliminary assessment questionnaires. And he's asked me, how do I qualify for residency? And I've sort of face planted. And I went back and I said to him, dude, are you telling me you moved your entire family to New Zealand? You got a job. Your end goal was permanent residency and a long-term stay, but you don't yet know if you qualify? I mean, seriously? His answer, believe it or not, was yes. He thought he needed the job, which was correct, to open up a pathway to residency, but he just assumed that once he had been working in New Zealand for a few years, the New Zealand government would give him residency. Wrong, 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 wrong. So people behave in strange ways when they are feeling like they are being pushed out of the country in which they live. And it's a really important observation. Most of you haven't dreamed all your lives of moving to New Zealand or Australia. What has happened is something has changed at home. In the US right now, for a lot of people, it's Trump. You're afraid of what tomorrow may bring. In South Africa, as I alluded to earlier, where thousands of our clients have come from, they're watching their country physically disintegrate. They haven't all dreamed of New Zealand or Australia. They've woken up one morning and they've thought, I can't do this anymore. I need to find somewhere better than where I am. Here's the second point. Migration is not cheap. The uber wealthy tend not to end up in New Zealand and Australia for all sorts of reasons. Some do. A lot of very wealthy Americans have been moving here in recent years. But the very rich tend to just move into gated communities, have good private medical insurance, put the kids into private schools, and get on with life, and they can go holidaying in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean or whatever they want to do. The very poor, who are often the ones who feel the need to change their circumstances most, are actually the ones who can afford to do it least. So the significant majority of our clients at IMMagine are what I define or I observe as being married, mortgaged, middle class, 2 children, urban professionals living in the suburbs. So they're not very rich people, they're not very poor people, but they are certainly people that have found the last 4 or 5 years incredibly difficult. And not to get all ooh-ah on you, when I look at what's happening around the world, it does seem to me inequality is growing. The poor are going to stay poor. The rich are getting richer. And you, like me, I'm married, mortgaged, middle class, 2 adult children living in the suburbs. We are the ones that are being squeezed. And we are the ones that are now looking to improve our circumstances, social and or economic, by moving country. But it's going to cost you money. And everybody wants to know, how much will it cost a family afford to move to Australia or New Zealand? Answer is, I can't tell you. Not because I don't want to, but because every pathway, both countries, different strategies, skills assessments, qualification assessments, registration for some of you to practice your trade, your occupation in New Zealand or Australia. It's going to be different for all of you. But if you are a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children, for example, you can reasonably expect visa application fees alone. So I'm not talking about the third parties that you have to deal with in both countries. I'm not talking about my fees. I'm not talking about airfares, shipping costs, settlement costs. I'm talking very specifically about visa fees. You're probably looking at around about 10 to 12,000 New Zealand dollars. And if you wanted that in US dollar terms, around about $6,000 to $8,000. Once you take into account professional legal fees, those third-party players in the process, you can probably double that number, and you'd be spending that money, I would think, actually you could be tripling that number for many of you, and you'd be spending that sort of money over 2 to 3 years. So it isn't cheap. The poor tend not to migrate. The very rich tend to holiday on their super yachts. So if you didn't get the vibe already, this is very much meant to be a reality check. And I've built a reputation, along with my business partner, Maya, running the Melbourne operation, of telling people what they need to know, not what they want to hear. There's plenty of people out there licensed to do what we do who will tell you whatever they think you want to hear to help you part with some money. Well, honestly, we don't need your money so badly we're going to screw up your lives. So it can be very blunt, it can be very brutal. My advice is always honest, and it's also transparent so that you can make a balanced decision to do this or not. Now, here's another little thought. Neither New Zealand nor Australia are perfect. And ultimately, if you're going to migrate and you haven't migrated already in your life, migration is very much what you make of it. I spend, as I said earlier, around 6 months of the year in a home that we own on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. I'm sitting in our apartment in downtown Auckland. My office is actually through the wall that you can't see. And I have 30 and 28-year-old sons, both in relationships. I recently became a granddad, loving it. And there's an awful lot that's wonderful about both of these countries. They're both really good places to raise families, but it would be very naive to think that we don't have the same social issues and economic pressures that many other people have. We have gangs, we have drugs, we kill people. You know, serious crime happens in New Zealand and Australia. But generally, when we compare it to places like South Africa or the US, it's kind of like a Sunday school picnic. But I make the point, and I think my view is very balanced because I do spend significant time each year in Australia. significant time in New Zealand. There's much about both countries I love. And if you asked me as a New Zealander, which is my favorite, I've got to be honest, it's a little bit like asking me, which of my two sons do I love the most? And the answer is, don't ask me that. It's impossible. I'm never going to be able to answer it. I actually love them both equally, but they're not exactly the same. And while New Zealanders and Australians have a lot in common as people, culturally, historically, we're definitely not exactly the same. And I often describe those Aussies that I interact with as being my very close first cousins, but not quite my brothers. This part of the presentation is designed to give you a little bit of an overview of where things are at. What does New Zealand or Australia look like if you haven't been to either, ever, or any time recently? And I'm sorry, there's a lot of statistics I'm going to throw at you, but it's all designed to paint a picture of what these places might be like if you are accepted to come and live here. In terms of GDP, and I hate GDP, I think it's a fairly meaningless metric of anything, but New Zealand, 5.3 million people, just a big village. Our GDP is roughly 260 billion US dollars a year. Australia, around 1.4 trillion US dollars and a population of 27 million. What this means is in terms of the value of goods and services produced in both countries, we are very firmly sitting in the OECD and the 22 most developed countries on the planet. So we are materially wealthy. The second metric on this slide, I think, starts getting more to what it means to be a New Zealander or an Australian. The World Prosperity Index measures non-material factors, things like quality of healthcare, quality of education, safety, security, governance, corruption, the freshness of our lakes and our rivers. It's these kind of intangibles. And you'll see here New Zealand comes in 10th in 2024, Australia 14th. And for those of you sitting in Southeast Asia, the US or South Africa, you can see where you compare when looking at New Zealand or Australia. So we are, in terms of non-material factors, extremely wealthy. We have a lot of opportunity, a lot of equality. And I would make the comment at this point, the inequality that exists in countries like South Africa, Hong Kong is a good example when it comes to Southeast Asia, China, and certainly the United States is nothing like what most of you experience. So much flatter sort of social structures. And that translates through to the third metric, the World Happiness Index. I mean, my God, the things the United Nations spends our money on. But actually, what this tells you is that New Zealanders and Australians are overwhelmingly very happy people. We gripe and we moan and we bitch about all sorts of things. But the bottom line is we're materially well off. We are wealthy in terms of non-material factors. And as a consequence, overwhelmingly, we are pretty happy when we look at the countries we like to compare ourselves to. Basically, what these three metrics describe are liberal socialist democracies. And all that means is that we believe in market forces. We also believe government has a role to play, particularly in healthcare and education. But we give a damn about our next door neighbor. We're okay redistributing wealth. And it's really interesting when you look at prosperity and world happiness, those countries that rank higher than New Zealand and Australia are overwhelmingly the Scandinavian countries, which are socialist to the maximum: Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland. And even though taxes in those countries are extremely high, they're also extremely happy and prosperous. Now, in New Zealand, in terms of taxation, we have the third lowest overall tax rates in the developed world. Australia comes in 11th. New Zealand has a very broad tax base, In Australia, it is more limited. And this is not meant to be an explanation of individual tax rates, but what I can tell you is that Australians tend to earn more than New Zealanders, but at the same time, they are taxed more highly. So bear that in mind if you're looking at the headlines of salaries and you're open to moving to both countries. They both have sales or GST, goods and services taxes. Australia has capital gains taxes, where New Zealand, for the most part, doesn't. But overall, New Zealanders pay around 28 cents on the dollar that they earn, and Australia's around about 30 cents on the dollar, more or less as a gross generalization. Now, when it comes to retirement, New Zealand is ranked 8th best in the world in which to retire, and Australia comes in at 9th. In New Zealand, when you turn 65, irrespective of your wealth, irrespective of whether you have saved your retirement, everybody gets a state or government paid pension. And at the time this is going to air, that's roughly $800 a week for a married couple. And it's about a third less if you are single. So what that means in New Zealand is if you retire, you have no mortgage, no debts, you're going to live with a degree of dignity. Personally, I wouldn't want to live off that pension. And as a consequence, and I've just turned 60, 30 years ago, I started a private retirement savings, as did my wife. And although it's not compulsory to do that in New Zealand, it's something like 80% of all workers do. So we save privately, and we still get, when we turn 65, the state government pension. So the billionaire and the pauper get the same pension in New Zealand when they turn 65. Frankly, it's unsustainable. New Zealand has a rapidly aging population, and I just do not understand why successive governments continue to rule out raising that age of entitlement and examining whether or not we should be means testing it, as they do in countries like Australia. So in Australia, retirement savings is overwhelmingly funded during your working years by your employer. So self-employed people can still save for their retirement and get all the tax breaks and all the rest of it that goes with it in Australia. But most people who are working for somebody else are paid their salary plus 12% on top. That is invested into a private wealth provider or through a private wealth provider. And when you turn 67, you get access to it. So very low threshold in Australia to lose your eligibility for a state pension when you turn 67. But the point here is both countries have got their way of trying to ensure aging populations do live with some dignity. Australia, I think, handles it much better than New Zealand does, because as I say, I don't think it takes an actuary or a maths genius to work out with a rapidly aging population, it surely cannot be sustained as effectively a freebie, even though we paid our tax when we turned 65. In terms of safety, and this is always of interest to the South Africans watching this, and increasingly to the Americans, New Zealand is ranked the 4th safest country in the world in which to live. Australia comes in at 22nd or 27th, depending on which survey you read. I've got to tell you, I find that really hard to believe. When I'm in southeast Queensland, at least, and my youngest son lives in Brisbane, my eldest lives in Auckland, I can tell you there's nothing unsafe about those parts of Australia that we spend our time in. So I'd take that one with a grain of salt. What I would say is overwhelmingly, both of these countries are extremely safe. Now, we're always asked, what does it cost to live in these cities, these countries? And again, bear in mind, the numbers I'm giving you describe my typical IMMagine client. And that is someone who is probably aged 25 to 55. They'll have a partner. There'll be a couple of children thrown in, and they are likely to be white-collar workers, artisans, engineers, teachers, nurses, working in banks, insurance companies, and so on. So let's assume there's 4 of you, 2 adults, 2 children. Once you've paid your taxes in New Zealand, you're going to need around $6,000 a month left over to put a roof over your head, food on the table, petrol in your Toyota or charge your Tesla, pay for your insurances, and so on. So that's probably around $8,000 per month before tax. Now in Auckland, you can probably add 20 to 25% to that because it's much more expensive living in Auckland, primarily a consequence of house and rental prices than it is across the rest of New Zealand. And ditto for Australia, probably around about 6,000 Australian a month nationally. But as soon as we start talking about Melbourne, Sydney, or Brisbane, you're probably adding another 25 to 30% for the same reasons as Auckland is more expensive than the rest of New Zealand. Now, typically, the clients that we represent, if there's two of you and you're both working, can expect a gross annual income of anywhere between $180,000 and $250,000 a month, which means once you've paid your taxes, you're probably taking home between $12,000 and $16,000 a month. Now, at the lower end, the $180,000, you're probably talking the electrician married to the secretary. It could be the relatively recently graduated high school teacher whose partner is a marketing assistant. As soon as you've got perhaps 10 years of work experience, irrespective of what you do, irrespective of which country you're coming from, I've observed salaries in New Zealand and Australia pretty much become the same as you are earning at home. So salaries become global to some extent. The key point about those first two matrices is that if you're both out there working, money is not going to be an issue. If only one of you is working and you're in one of the biggest cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Auckland, Wellington, maybe Christchurch in New Zealand, then one income, you're going to get by if you're earning, say, $100,000. But again, cards on the table. I would not want to be raising children in Auckland on less than $120,000 a year before tax. It would be extremely difficult. But what you need to remember, New Zealand, in common with Australia, we don't pay for the bulk of our healthcare. We don't pay for the bulk of our children's education. So in New Zealand, you can, if you choose, have private medical insurance. I haven't wasted too much money on it, and I'm now 60 and arthritic fingers. My wife and I do have a surgery or specialist cover. We spend probably 2% of our income on that, and that gives us access to a private hospital if we didn't want to wait to go into the public hospital system, in which, while the care and quality is very high, you can find waiting lists in order to have the surgery or the procedure that you need. Australia is the same, has dealt with it in slightly different ways. They do encourage private medical insurance. The bulk of people continue to rely on the health system run by the government, and they do give you tax credits if you do take out private medical insurance. I'm honestly not sure which is the best. In both countries, those systems are under enormous pressure. Aging populations, increasing cost of the technologies that are available, and lifespans which are now into the mid to late 80s in both countries. In fact, I was quite excited, having just turned 60, to learn that if you're still breathing when you're 65 years old in New Zealand or Australia, you are now highly likely to live until you are in your mid-90s. So fingers crossed I make it to 65. So the point here is, many of you come from countries where you've got to pay for your children's education, you've got to pay for your healthcare, you've got to save for your retirement, and therefore, although some things in New Zealand and Australia are much more expensive than where you come from, and that's partly the tyranny of distance, in New Zealand's case, a smaller population, it's just that we do things differently. We are socialist democracies where we're happy to pay slightly higher taxes if it means the person next door has equal access to healthcare and education and the opportunities of good health and good education. At the moment, we've got interest rates coming down fairly rapidly in New Zealand. In fact, these numbers are a little bit out of date for New Zealand. Australia interest rates are standing still, and that's primarily because in New Zealand, the life has been squeezed out of the economy over the last 18 months. Inflation has plummeted from 7% to around about 2%. In Australia, it's still hovering closer to 3%. And therefore, across the Tasman in Australia, the Reserve Bank is keeping her, or the governor is keeping her foot on the throat of the Australian economy. So interest rates today in New Zealand for a fixed rate are around about 5%, floating rates of variable mortgages around about 7%, and they're very similar across the Tasman Sea in Australia. House prices across New Zealand for a 200 square metre, 2,000 square foot for those of you in America. So a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, kitchen, lounge, dining room, lock-up garage for your Toyota. You're paying around $750,000 New Zealand for that at the current time. The same house across Australia, $850,000. Sydney sitting at 1.2 million Australian, 770,000 in Melbourne, Brisbane a touch under 900, and actually both Perth and Adelaide are creeping up towards 900 as well. So the major capital cities in Australia, you're pushing $1 million. Auckland, you're pushing $1 million. But once you get outside of those capitals and the big city here in New Zealand, you can probably shave a good 25 to 30% off. Economic growth is fairly anemic in both countries at the moment, projected to be around 1.6% this year in New Zealand, increasing to 3% next year. Australia sitting around about the same. Unemployment in New Zealand is the highest it's been now for 2.5, 3 years. We're sitting at 4.8%. Australia currently sitting at 3.9%. Because the interest rates in Australia are being held higher for longer, there is an expectation that they will probably tick up to somewhere around 4.2, 4.3. The talk is interest rates will start falling in Australia sometime this year. But again, the governor of the Reserve Bank has made it very clear they didn't go hard enough or high enough on interest rates when New Zealand, the US, the UK, Europe, everybody else did to beat the inflation genie back into its bottle. So they're going to be living with higher interest rates for longer and probably marginally higher unemployment. So how do you get a job? Now, many of you coming to New Zealand are going to need a job in order to secure residency or a work visa. Most of our clients going to Australia do not need jobs to secure provisional or permanent residency. So tuck that thought away. And this is the reason why for a great number of you, even if you want to come and live in New Zealand, you have a consultation with us. Do not be surprised if we say, do you know what? We're going to get you permanent residency of Australia because you don't need a job to make it happen. And that permanent resident visa of Australia entitles you. So it's not discretionary. If you hold permanent residency of Australia, you land at Auckland Airport or any other airport here in New Zealand, you are entitled by law to a New Zealand resident visa on arrival. So those of you that we look after that are going to go to Australia, this slide doesn't really apply to you to quite the same extent as those coming to New Zealand. But given that you will need to work to put food on the table, how do you get a job in New Zealand or Australia? Well, over 35 years, I've been watching tens of thousands of people trying to answer that question. And I've identified 4 key drivers that determine the speed with which our clients get work. Here's the first one. If you want a job in New Zealand, be in New Zealand when you're looking for a job. Same in Australia. Why is that important? Most employers are reluctant to engage with visas. They don't understand them. They can be expensive. And particularly in Australia, there's some quite onerous responsibilities placed on employers of temporary workers. More than that, Employers want to know you are serious, you're committed, and you are available. So if you're sitting in Singapore or Shanghai or St. Louis or Johannesburg and you're firing off applications that you've seen for jobs online, you're not really sending the signals of commitment. So there's point number one. Over 95% of my clients coming to New Zealand or Australia, who come to New Zealand or Australia to find the job, get the job. But only about 15% of those sitting overseas will get a job. So it's pretty clear to me, employers want to see the whites of your eyes sitting across the table in a formal interview situation. Here is the second driver. Both of these countries speak English, more or less. The Aussies, sometimes you need subtitles, but hey. So it kind of goes without saying, I hope the better your English language ability, spoken and written, the more employable generally you become. If you're having any difficulty understanding my New Zealand accent, you could be in trouble because this is what we sound like here. So English language fluency is a critical factor, and an employer doesn't know from a CV how good your comprehension of and your spoken English is going to be. The third is cultural compatibility. And what do I mean by that? And I don't mean to cause anybody any offense, but I'm a straight talker and I'm going to tell you what you need to know, not what you want to hear. The more different you are culturally from the dominant cultures of New Zealand and Australia, sometimes the harder it can be to find work. Think about it. If your first language is French and you come from a country in the middle of Africa, then culturally you're going to be more different to your average Australian or New Zealander than you would be if you're coming from Johannesburg or Harare or Britain or Scotland or the US or Singapore or Malaysia. So the more different you are, the more difficult it can become, especially in customer-facing or leadership roles. And again, I would like to think it's kind of obvious. Now, outside that window, which you can't see, is New Zealand's main street. And if I go and stand at that window and I look outside or listen, I will probably hear 50 different languages being spoken by 50 different nationalities of people walking down the street. In New Zealand, in Auckland, it is said that we have over 185 different languages regularly spoken. And a recent survey suggested that Auckland is more diverse than New York City. So I don't want you to get any feelings of, oh, they must be a bunch of racists or rednecks. It isn't like that at all. I think the true reason why English language fluency is important and why cultural fit is critical is because both New Zealand and Australia have very, very strict employee protection laws. It can actually be quite hard, and I'm speaking as an employer, to get people out of your organization that aren't performing or who don't fit. So rather than risk a constructive dismissal claim in an employment court, sometimes employers will say, do you know what? You're an immigrant. You're a bit different to the people I'm used to. So no, I'm not going to give you a job. So take that in the spirit in which I offer it. I'm not saying be scared. If you speak really good English, you're almost certainly going to get a job, but you will need to be in New Zealand. And here's the fourth, resilience. Many of you, if you're choosing New Zealand or New Zealand is choosing you, will demand you have a job. And based on these criteria, you'll be in New Zealand when you're looking for it. And for many of you, that will mean resigning your job, jumping on a plane, coming to New Zealand, spending 2 or 3 months being rejected day after day after day, until one employer says, yep, I want you. What happens next? Well, what happens next is, as your immigration advisor, I'm going to be on the phone to the employer, getting the details I need to advise you and the employer whether we now have all the ingredients to bake a work visa or residency cake. So securing work is not, in fact, about skill shortages. Of course, skill shortages play a role, but overwhelmingly, these are the four criteria, the drivers that I've observed that determine who gets work in New Zealand or Australia. Now, many of you will have looked for work. You've been online already. Now you're starting to scratch your head. I'm getting confused. I see all these jobs in New Zealand and Australia, but when I go to apply for it, I'm told I don't have a work visa, so I can't apply. And here's the paradox. In New Zealand, overwhelmingly, there's some exceptions, but overwhelmingly, you can only get the job if you have the work visa. But you can't get the work visa if you don't have the job. So how do you break the cycle? I don't have a magic wand to make that happen. What I do know is who is employable, why they're employable, and then I will generally encourage you to gather the visa paperwork we're going to need and for you to come to New Zealand to look for that job. But I'll say it one final time, if you want to come and live in New Zealand and you're consulting with my team, don't be surprised if we tell you, forget all this nonsense. We're going to secure you permanent residence of Australia before you leave home. And once your visa is approved, you fly to Australia, you activate it simply by landing and passing through passport control. You go to the Air New Zealand transfer desk. You pick up your boarding pass, you fly to New Zealand. You are entitled by law to residency on arrival. So then when you start looking for jobs and the employers ask, have you got a work visa? You can say, better than that, pal. I've already got a resident visa. I can now work for whoever I like, and the immigration department has no more say in what happens. There's no forms, there's no fees, and you as the employer have zero obligations other than what you would have if you were employing a New Zealander. So that is how my clients get jobs in New Zealand and Australia. Now, I want to start talking to you about the visa process, but a few thoughts. Here are my 4 golden rules. For you to survive this process without losing your minds over the next 2 or 3 years, which is how long the end-to-end process is likely to take, I have 4 golden rules. And I didn't just make these up. They kind of, over the years, I started to realize that these 4 thoughts fully sum up the experience you are about to go through. Here's number 1. When it comes to immigration and visa rules, suspend logic. Immigration is political, and never at any time in my 35 years more than it is in 2025. I mean, look at the United States, look at Europe. Australia is slashing numbers of international students because there's too many immigrants. Canada is doing the same, too late for Trudeau. But they're doing the same for the same reason. New Zealand has cut back lower skilled worker numbers in response to the politics of immigration. Here's number 2, assume nothing about your eligibility. You cannot get 98% of a visa. I'll say it several times in the course of this presentation. You make one wrong move, you will be declined. So when I have consultations with people, everyone's done their research. Everybody says to me, oh, I qualify under this pathway, that pathway. I get points for this. I get points for that. This is my nominated occupation. That's my nominated occupation. Honestly, sometimes people get it right, but for the most part, they get it badly wrong. So don't assume anything about your eligibility. It is dangerous. Golden rule number 3. Just when you think you understand the rules, either they will change them or your visa will be processed by a moron who doesn't understand their own rules. Now, in terms of change, it's a really important point. From the day you decide to migrate to the day you're invited to apply for residency in Australia or you file your resident visa in New Zealand, time becomes your enemy. The one constant in this game is rule changes. They change the rules all the time. Hardly a week goes by when we don't get a notification from the New Zealand government and the Australian government saying, we're changing this, we're changing that, we're tweaking this, we're tweaking that. So time becomes your enemy. Rules change because of the politics and the economics that immigration feeds into. Golden rule number 4, treat with enormous caution what you read online, and in particular, government websites. Look, if you're interested in Australia and you've been onto the Australian website, if you can understand it, you're doing better than me. And I read it every single day. The problem with the New Zealand immigration website is the rules around visas are not laws. They're not legislative instruments as the rules are in Australia. And as a consequence of that, immigration officers in New Zealand have an enormous degree of latitude how they interpret rules. So you can present the same evidence, arguing the same criteria for 2 clients. So everything is the same. You give that to 2 different immigration officers in New Zealand, you will get 2 different answers. One will say yes, one will say no. It does my head in. The level of inconsistency in the implementation of rules, particularly in New Zealand, is astounding. But it accounts for the extremely high failure rate of most visa categories in New Zealand. I will say one thing nice about the Australian Department of Home Affairs, because they outsource most of the pre-visa assessment work, English, skills, state governments, and so on, they very rarely argue with the visa application evidence that we present. In New Zealand, a lot of the thinking, so-called, is done within the department. And the immigration department here in New Zealand has an ongoing issue attracting and retaining people capable of anything approaching critical thinking. And I hesitate to say New Zealand is a lottery or that you're about to play Russian roulette, but honestly, that's what it sometimes feels like. And yes, it's a plug for us. I can pick up the phone, I can text the minister, I can email the person who runs the immigration department if I have a problem, and they will listen to me and my team. They really, really will. So I don't deal with the counter-level immigration officers. I can go higher to more experienced, pragmatic, helpful immigration officers. So, not to labor the point, both New Zealand and Australia have both temporary and resident visas. And the reason I'm showing you this slide is because a great many of you who want to live permanently in New Zealand or Australia actually require multiple classes of visas. There's not just one. And what I find is the most of you, if you want to live in Australia, try and work out what the permanent residency rules are. And it's exactly the same in New Zealand. Without acknowledging or realizing you're going to need 2 or 3 different visas before you can remain permanently in New Zealand. And each of these different visa types have their own aim, their own objective, their own rules. And sometimes, believe it or not, those rules of those temporary visas undermine the residency rules. And if you're not an expert in all 3, you can trip yourself up or be tripped up because you'll say one thing when you file one kind of visa, and it'll come back and bite you on the backside when you're applying for a different kind of visa, normally your residency visa. So understand that point. Multiple visas for many of you. And this next slide is designed to illustrate the point. New Zealand has, I think, something like 40 or 50 different visa types. And Australia is even more bizarre. 27 different pathways to residency of Australia. 27 different visa types for residency and around 75 different temporary visas for Australia. So, hey, if you can work out what you need, maybe you don't need people like us. Now, in terms of pathways, skilled, family, and business are the big three, the super categories, if you like. And beneath those are what I'd call substreams or subcategories. I'm not going to talk much about business. I'm not going to talk a whole heap about family. I really want to focus on skilled. But let me just say this about business. If you're interested in moving to Australia and you wish to become self-employed, or you wish to invest in a business as a way to gain residency, you cannot. The current government turfed out the business investor pathways a couple of years ago, and at this point are showing no great inclination of reinstating them. New Zealand has two pathways to residency for those with a bit of money. We do have an entrepreneur pathway, which is normally an entrepreneur work visa, followed by an entrepreneur resident visa. One is given to you so that you can put in place the business plan you presented to the New Zealand government, and minimum 2 years after you have been granted the visa and started your business, you have delivered on everything, right down to the last dollar in sales you said you were going to in your original business plan. So the entrepreneur pathway normally takes 2, 3, 4 years to prepare, lodge, for you to do your business, then to apply for residency and secure it. It has a failure rate, a decline rate of over 90%. So my advice generally to people is do not touch the entrepreneur pathway for New Zealand. Most likely it'll cost you an enormous amount of money and it will blow up in your face. So beware. New Zealand does have a not very popular business investor pathway, which has attracted in the last 3 years approximately 33 successful applicants. So the bar is extremely high. The criteria are not overly attractive to most people with money, but very broadly, you must invest funds which you have lawfully earned or acquired of between 5 million New Zealand dollars and 15 million New Zealand dollars. The more passive your investment in New Zealand, the higher the value of that 4-year investment needs to be. The bulk of our clients who are qualifying under this pathway or looking to, and there's a fair number of Americans at the moment who are sniffing around the category, they are investing between 10 and 11 million New Zealand dollars. So look, it's not for those who don't have an awful lot of money to spend. The business investor is far more certain than the entrepreneur. And in fact, we've never had one declined. As I say, it's not very popular. Remember, I'm recording this in January 2025. We are expecting changes to the threshold to secure the business investor visa of New Zealand. Rumour has it in the next 2 to 4 months. I'm expecting that they may not lower the overall investment amounts, but they may change the investments that you can make, which should make this policy much more attractive to a whole lot more people. So look, that's business. Family, if you are married to or living with a New Zealand citizen or resident in a straight or a gay relationship, that is your ticket in. It's the least complex. In New Zealand, it tends to be, if you've never lived together, a multi-year process involving work visa for the non-resident, which then in time allows you to apply for a resident visa once you have been living together for 12 months. If you're overseas and living together and have been for 5 years or more, you can apply for permanent residency, not residency straight away. So there's some variations on it in New Zealand, but it's all about living together in a genuine and stable relationship. Australia is the same. New Zealand processes these things far more quickly. In Australia, to get permanent residency as the partner of an Aussie takes 3 to 4 years. You will be given work rights during that time if you're in Australia. And I think partly, this may be the cynic in me, the reason it takes so long to process is they want to test the relationship is genuine. And if it takes them 3 or 4 years to assess, well, I guess that's the best possible test of just how genuine the relationship may be. I want to spend a few minutes talking about parents. We're always asked about mum and dad. Can they come with me? Or if there's only mum or only dad. Both countries have pathways for parents. Neither country allows you to include your parents in your application, so they must make their own. Dealing with New Zealand first, we have 2 pathways. Both require the parent to have at least 1 adult child, normally and ordinarily resident, so a resident visa holder or citizen in New Zealand. That child and or their partner must earn a minimum amount of money to act as a sponsor to a parent. A parent can then file an expression of interest in residency, and it goes into a pool, and periodically at random, parents are selected from that pool. So it is absolutely a ballot, 100% a lottery. It's restricted to 2,500 visas a year. And your chances of being selected are not actually very high. But for many of you, it's the only option you've got. Now, I should also add at this point, if your stomach churned, thinking you might not be able to join your adult children and maybe your grandchildren in New Zealand, the government is currently working on, and I am expecting in the next few months, for there to be a new 5-year renewable temporary visa for parents. And if the parents hold medical insurance and public indemnity insurance, details I do not have, then they are eligible for that visa. And the whole idea of that, I think, is to recognize that there's a limited number of places for parents permanently. And if we take more, the problem with old people is they need, more likely to need healthcare on the taxpayer. So rather than giving tens of thousands of older people the chance to put even more pressure on our health system, the government is talking about 5-year renewable visas, so you can keep renewing as long as you're breathing and you're holding medical insurance. So watch this space. I expect that to become a policy in the next probably 12 to 18 months. But remember, that's a temporary visa. The second residency visa is for parents who tick the following 3 boxes, or 4. 1 child in New Zealand. Box number 2, you have a net worth, you and or your partner, of 1.5 million New Zealand dollars in cash and or assets. Of that 1.5 million dollars, you will transfer and invest in New Zealand $1 million for a period of 4 years. The final criteria is that in the 12 months before the government assesses your application, you must have earned 60,000 New Zealand dollars. And if you tick all those boxes, you're healthy and of good character, you will be granted a resident visa. So that's New Zealand, that's parents. Australia, 2 pathways. 1, it currently takes around 26 years, I'm not making that up, 26 years to process, so forget about it. The second requires you to have the same or more adult children ordinarily resident in Australia than in any other single country, right? The same or more adult children than in any other country. So if you have 3 children, 1 in Australia, 1 in New Zealand, 1 in Hong Kong, you're going to qualify for Australia. 2 in Hong Kong, 1 in Australia, you don't qualify. Right? So the same or more in Australia. Then, if you're healthy and of good character, it is a process. It's not like our lottery in New Zealand. It is a process. It will happen. It'll just take a few years. The application fees are incredibly steep, around 50,000 Australian dollars per parent, of which approximately 14,000 is given back after 10 years. If you don't go and ask the government for welfare. So the Australian system is far more prescriptive, and might feed into the decision for some of the skilled migrants we represent to actually move to Australia when at first they were thinking about New Zealand. Okay, so there are pathways for parents. I should add one more thing about Australia. For some of you, some of the time, you can spend the time the government of Australia is processing your parent residency visa in Australia with your family. But this is not the time to talk in great detail about that. But what I want to finish up with now is just talking you through the skilled migrant for both countries. And when it comes to Australia, you've effectively got two pathways. One, relying on a job offer, and one that does not rely on a job offer. Our preference every time a coconut is going to be securing provisional or permanent residency without needing a job. So what is all this? What are all these numbers? Very briefly, because it does not impact on a lot of our clients. If you have a skilled job offer, that job offer needs to appear on a number of different skilled occupation lists. The Aussies have occupation lists for every day of the week. But depending on the job you have, and depending on where in Australia that job is, will determine the pathway. So we have the direct entry. So there's a bunch of people who, with a genuine skilled job offer that ticks a whole lot of boxes, can apply for permanent residency under the subclass 186. Others will need to get what they call a skills in demand work visa. Think of that as being an employer-specific work visa, which is labour market tested. And then once you've worked for a period of time, so long as the employer agrees to sponsor you for permanent residency, and that is a trap for inexperienced players, because if they don't agree to sponsor you once you've worked for a couple of years, or however long the case may be in your circumstances, you are screwed. And it's another reason we don't like this policy in terms of giving people some good advice. So there is that 482 work visa through to a 186 permanent residence. And that primarily applies to people in the major centres in Australia. And then, although it looks different in name, it's actually a very similar process. The skilled employer regional visa, which again is an employer-specific work visa. And once you've worked for a period of time, if the employer agrees to nominate, sponsor you for permanent residence, you apply under the subclass 191. Now, remember what I said about how do you get jobs in Australia and New Zealand? Well, that is very pertinent to those of you who might choose this pathway. But if you've got this pathway, my advice is that you do not go hunting for a job until you've secured a residence class visa. So general skilled migration, it is a points-tested system. You must be under the age of 45 when you are invited to apply for your residence visa by the Australian government. You are going to be granted points for your age, your education, your years of work experience in your nominated occupation, your level of English language, your marital status, whether you have a partner that can also add points to your application, and for some of you, what we call state government sponsorship or support. Under this pathway, 3 different kinds of residency visas. Provisional residence, called a 491, permanent residence called 189 or 190. I'll explain that a bit more in a second. Generally takes us between 6 and 12 months to prepare everything the Australian federal government needs to assess your residency application. Processing times from the time we file, between 8 and 18 months most of the time. How many points do you need? Short answer, nobody can tell you at this point. Why? The federal government demands you have 65 points or more. It is the federal government of Australia that sets the policies. It's the federal government that grants the visas. But Australia, if you're not aware of the history and politics of it, is 8 states and territories and 1 federal government. For those of you watching this from the US, it's not dissimilar in many respects. A lot of power resides with state governments in Australia, and to some extent, the federal government is actually quite weak. And Australia is geographically enormous. It's huge. The whole of Europe fits comfortably inside Australia. The US fits into Australia. There's room on the sides. Economically, it's very diverse. So each of these state governments have their own politics, their own economics, their own agendas. So a number of years ago, not that many actually, the federal government effectively outsourced to the state and territorial governments the decision on who is going to get into Australia. Each state government has its own residency program. Each state government has its own shopping list of the occupations they wish to support, the annual quota of each occupation they wish to support, and criteria for each occupation they wish to support. So you might be a civil engineer. There might be 3 state governments looking for you. They might have 3 different assessment processes, 3 different point systems overlaid by a federal point system, which is going to determine how many points you need to get into Australia. So for those of you going down the points pathway, you've got the 189 independent, as you look at the screen on the left-hand side. All that means is you're claiming points for an occupation that the federal government says you've got enough points, don't worry about the state government. So that's an independent permanent residence application. Then we get what we call the 190 and the 491. Both demand state government support. And the state government will decide, sorry if you're wondering what I was doing, I just had another thought, but I'm just going to park it. State government nomination, they will decide whether they're going to support you for an unconditional permanent residence visa or a provisional visa. And actually, forget the word temporary in there. It's actually misleading, and I must change the slide. It's not actually a temporary visa. It is truly provisional permanent residency. What is the difference? When you step off the plane in Australia with a permanent residence subclass 190, you are free to live, work, play wherever you like. There is an expectation you will settle in the state that nominated you, but it is not a legal requirement that you do so. So effectively, when you walk out of the airport in Australia, you are free. Do whatever you want. If you win the lottery as you pass through the arrival hall, go and buy some prawns and a barbie and lie on the beach for the rest of your life. You can do whatever you want. The provisional residence visa is a little different, not significantly. You are expected to live in the state that nominated you, but you are not required to. You do not have to work in the occupation you nominated, but within 5 years of stepping off that plane, you or your partner, so not necessarily the primary applicant that got you into Australia, one of the two of you must present 3 financial year tax assessments, and you will then be given permanent residency. So it's not the government doesn't care what you do when you leave the airport. They're saying, if you pay tax for 3 years, whether you're working or not, then we're going to grant you permanent residency at the end of it. So in terms of the order of events for those 3 visas that I've just explained, this is normally how it works. Mandatory English language exam for all of you. Some of you are exempted, but they give you no points if you don't do it, and you will need the points to maximize your chances of getting into Australia. After that, or at the same time, we have to do a skills assessment. What is a skills assessment, and why do I make the comment on this slide? It is critical. Because going back to my golden rules, it's not always logical what you should nominate. and people make endless assumptions about what they should nominate. So I go back to my point about state government occupation lists and getting the support of state government. So one reason why getting the occupation right is critical is because they may not be looking for you if you nominate occupation X. But if you can genuinely nominate occupation Y, then you're opening yourself up to being selected by one of these state governments. And I'll give you a really, really good example. Accountant versus finance manager. We deal with hundreds of accountants every year wanting to go to Australia. You need incredibly high points in order to secure one of the finite number of places to be invited by the federal government. We've just had one, actually, and I think his score was about 100 points, which is stratospheric. Most people come in around 65 to 85 points. Now, he was lucky enough that we found him a state government to nominate him because his points were very high. Very often with accountants, what we do is we package them up. And when we file a skills assessment, we nominate finance manager. Both those occupations have BComs, both majored normally in accounting. The finance manager may have started work as an accountant, may still be working as an accountant. But we can, because the tasks of a finance manager and an accountant overlap, we can quite legitimately and lawfully nominate finance manager because we can. He's just as much able to be called this as being called this. And we know today you're far more likely to be nominated or sponsored by a state government with a lower point score if you are a finance manager rather than an accountant. So it's not at all dodgy. In fact, the system expects you to find the best fit that maximizes your chances. I mean, we can't turn a sow's ear into a silk purse. I can't turn a plumber into a high school teacher. But my business partner, who's a very smart man, did once turn a lawyer into a real estate agent. Very legitimate and incredibly clever. And that's how that guy got his residency in Australia. So a really crucial part of the consultation I have with you, or my colleagues do, will be identifying the best occupation to nominate. And don't assume what you call yourself is either the best occupation or what we are going to call you. Once those things are done, then and only then can you file your expression of interest in residency. Ordinarily, it is only at that point where we can now go and find a state government to nominate you and your family. There's no point looking today because they won't and they can't touch you. So coming back to my comment about time is your enemy, when you make the decision to do this thing, you move quickly, because I know what state governments are looking for today. I don't know what they're going to be looking for this time next year. So the sooner we get to the point of us being able to go and advocate on your behalf with the state government, the better. Now, remember, some of you may not need state government nomination. You still file your expression of interest. You will be selected at some point under one of these pathways, invited to apply for residency. You have a 60-day window in which to file what is in effect a decision-ready visa application, except no medical examination, no security clearances at that point. But everything else must be filed within 60 days, or they will, underlined will, decline you. So I mentioned earlier, processing times, 8 months to 18 months, plus or minus. When you're approved, each family member has a maximum period of roughly 10 months to fly to Australia to activate the visa. And those of you landing with provisional residency, as I said earlier, 3 years after you land, you will be granted permanent residency. Actually, I left something out of that. 3 years, 3 financial year tax assessments, and also provisional residency. You're not allowed to live or work in Melbourne, Sydney, or Brisbane while you qualify for the unconditional permanent visa, right? 3 tax assessments from one or other of you. Cannot live or work in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. But even that criteria has become quite loose and flexibly interpreted, working from home, remote work, and so on. So there are sometimes workarounds if circumstances allow. But that is primarily how the Australian skilled migrant process works. Turning now to New Zealand and our skilled migrant pathways here. All options demand you have a skilled job first before you can apply for a resident visa. For a great number of you, it is going to mean securing an employer-specific work visa, and that in turn is going to mean being in New Zealand, and that in turn will mean for many of you a visitor visa to come over. Some of you, if you come from certain countries, and I am including the US very specifically in this, if you're under the age of 31, then you can secure a 12-month unconditional open work visa called a holiday working visa. Any young British citizens watching this, some Singaporeans, there's a great number of countries that we have this reciprocal program allowing young people to work in one another's countries, and you will be given a work visa before you come over. And that is critical and can be very useful for some of you in terms of finding the job that is going to open the door to residency. But back to the pathways. We have the green list, which is a list, or 2 lists actually, of occupations deemed to be an acute, historical, ongoing demand. Basically, we don't produce enough of those people to fill the jobs that we are creating. If you're on the tier 1 list, so long as you tick all the boxes, it could be registration, it could be salary, it could be qualifications, it could be all sorts of things, you can then file residency immediately. For others, you have to work for 2 years before you are allowed to apply for your resident visa. The bulk of people coming to New Zealand, however, come in under the point system. And I'll explain this one in a little bit more detail in a minute, but you need 6 points, one of you, only one primary applicant per family. You must have your skilled job, and then your points are made up by your education or New Zealand registration or the salary you've got in New Zealand with the job, and up to 3 years of work in New Zealand to accrue the balance of your points. Now, for a small number of you, there is a third pathway, and these are sector agreements the government has established, primarily in healthcare. So nursing aides, nursing assistants, aged care workers, people like that. There is a 2-year work to residency pathway. Those jobs are not deemed to be highly skilled, but they are incredibly valuable with a rapidly aging population and a local workforce that doesn't particularly want to doesn't particularly want to work in those sorts of occupations. So we do sometimes get nurses from the Philippines and other countries, and the way they secure residency actually is under the healthcare sector agreement. So for most people that we deal with here at IMMagine, it's plan B or C. Normally the green list or points is the preferred pathway. So green list, tier 1, straight to residency. Tier 2, you've got to work for 2 years before you can apply for residency. In terms of the point system, this is the pathway, this is how it works. So it looks a little bit like Australia, but different in many respects. So you've got your job, or sorry, forget that for the moment. English exam, we don't give points in New Zealand for your English. Some of you are exempt from doing it. Others will need to do it as part of the visa process for residency. Some of you will have qualifications, bachelor degrees or higher, that are automatically recognized as being comparable to certain qualifications here. That will determine your points. So before you start thinking about looking for a job, our advice is simple. Get all the information you are ever going to need We check it, we make sure it's in hand, it's fit for purpose. English exams, qualification assessments, visa documents in hand. Then you go looking for a job. For some of you, as I said earlier, visitor visa to come over to look for work. You find work. We've covered off how you're going to go about that. We then normally secure a work visa for you. If you have a partner, generally an open work visa for them, so they don't need the job to get it. Student visas for children aged 5 or more. Your children go to school as domestic students. So you pay for them to go to school, what we pay for our kids. And you will then work for up to 3 years to accrue your 6 points. So we have a reasonable number of clients who can get their 6 points through registration in New Zealand, or having a PhD, or a salary of around $180,000 a year. They have got their 6 points, they have job, go straight to residency. If you had, for example, a bachelor degree recognized as being comparable to a New Zealand bachelor, and we established that at the second point on the slide, we know that's worth 3 points. So therefore, you will, on the face of it, need to work for 36 months to accrue the final points to become eligible to apply for residency. So here are the combination of those points. These, and I don't know if you're taking screenshots or photos or whatever, but this is worthwhile taking, because these 4 boxes provide you with the combinations. Again, the slide I've just realized needs some work. There should be or between, forget the top left box, but the other ones. It's a combination, remember what I just said, between registration, qualification, job, and up to 3 years of working in New Zealand. I just realized I'm not sure this slide explains it as well as it probably should, although I did put the word "and" in there. So maybe I'm a bit better at this than I thought. So look, that's a really good one to take a screenshot of, and it basically gives you the core of what you need. But I don't want you to go away thinking that, oh, I've got a bachelor degree, all I need to do is work for 3 years, they're going to give me residency. If it was as simple as that, we would be out of business. There's a lot more meat that has to go on these bones, but that's basically how the point system works. So look, pulling this all together, and those of you that have sat through the whole thing, thanks for hanging in there. I hope it's been useful. A really good immigration advisor appreciates that what you're about to do is somewhat akin to climbing Mount Everest, right? It looks great from a distance. Everyone's up for the challenge. Everyone thinks, yeah, I need to leave home. I need to get to the top of the mountain and enjoy the view. Well, try climbing that mountain. Seriously, try climbing it. Most of you will perish on the mountain, particularly if you go it alone. I'm a mountain guide. I spend my life up there in the zone of death, helping people, dragging them one step at a time to the top of this mountain to deliver that precious residency visa at the end of it. So a good mountain guide always has a contingency plan, and sometimes a second or a third contingency plan. So all the visa matrix slide is trying to do is to demonstrate to you that as we climb the mountain with a very clear goal in mind and a very clear plan A, sometimes we get to a fork in the road and there's an avalanche or a crevasse is opened up or a storm blows. Governments change rules. Your circumstances change. I need to know if I take the right fork in the road, what lies ahead? If I take the left fork, what lies ahead? And my team and I are really, really good at it. 99+% success rate over 36 years. And this slide explains why. We know what is around the next corner. And if we don't, if we come to a dead end, we can double back and head up another path. And so all I'm trying to demonstrate with this slide is relying on a single plan, a single pathway up this mountain is dangerous. And it's very, very rare for us not to have more than one pathway up the mountain. So where do you go from here? If you've already been in touch with us and you're watching this video as a consequence of that preliminary assessment we did, I urge you to book a consultation. Look, I appreciate some people at this point are just looking, particularly a lot of Americans. But if you really want to find out what is the meat on the bones of the strategy that they've identified for us, then for goodness sake, book the consultation. Yes, it costs you 250 Australian dollars. It'll be so detailed. You will thank the day you watch this video and you had the consultation. I guarantee to tell you what you need to know. I guarantee I will not sweet talk you. I will not try and talk you into migration. I'm not going to tell you New Zealand's the best country in the world or Australia is the center of the universe, because they aren't. I'm going to explain to you your options, the opportunities, how employable you are, the costs, the timelines, what you should be worried about. And you get a chance to pick my brains and ask me all those things, parent to parent, that are important to you as an immigrant. When does my child start school? Do my kids get free dental care? How do I enroll with my local general practitioner's office? How do I open a bank account? How do I get a driver's license? I'm a Kiwi, I live here. And if you're going to Australia, we'll get you working with the team in Melbourne, who come from all over Australia, now just happen to live in Melbourne. So it's going to cost you a lot of money to migrate. I said earlier, government visa fees now, over $10,000 for your average family. You apply yourself, you get it wrong, you've just blown $10,000. If you come to me, it'll happen once, and you don't have to go crawling back and apply again. So if you want to book a consultation, I'm Iain at justimagine.com. Email me, or you can email Tom at justimagine.com, and we can tee up a time and a date. We'll ask you to pay in advance through PayPal, and you don't need an account with PayPal to use it if you're not familiar. Don't worry about all of that. We're going to give you some instructions. But I urge you to book the consultation. I don't get rich out of consulting with people. They take an awful lot of time. But it does allow you to understand the detailed strategy that we have in mind for you and your family. So look, I hope that was useful. I know it was a very long presentation, but I wish you all the best, and I look forward to consulting with you at some time in the not too distant future.